Welcome back to China in the News. Today, we're exploring a complex and heated issue: Huawei's AI chips and US export control that are making waves globally. Doug, you've consulted for Huawei in the past, so I'm really looking forward to hearing your insights on this. But let me start with some background. Recently, the US Commerce Department warned that Huawei's AI chip, particularly the Ascend processors, violate export controls because they're likely made with US technology. Using these chips could trigger criminal penalties. So, Doug, why does the US apply export control to advanced technologies like these?
So it's great to be here with you, Christine, as always. And this is such an important topic. I mean, we're thinking about U.S.-China relations and global trade and tariff wars, and all of this stuff really matters. And as you mentioned, I have a deep history with Huawei. I was back, going back 30 years, I've been sort of thinking about U.S.-China relations and the ways in which companies are advancing U.S. companies and investing in China, and then Chinese companies eventually investing in the United States. And when I was dean of the business school at George Washington University, I just got deeply involved with Huawei. And this was 2010 to 2013. And so it was a time when, we were sort of thinking about the growing tensions between US-China relations and technology. And China isn't just a place of cheap manufacturing labor, but actually building a really powerful manufacturing sector on its own. And Huawei was expanding and advancing in the United States. And so at that time, I became close to the Huawei leadership team and spent a lot of time sort of helping them think. And this was before the Huawei ban in the United States. And so Huawei's just been on my radar screen for so many years. And so I'm so thankful to be talking with you about this. Um, you know, Basically, the United States enforces export controls in areas of high-tech economy to protect national security, right? And so, like, if you think back about the Huawei case and Huawei's first ban from the United States, the issues in Congress were that, I mean, Huawei built itself on creating switching technology. And so, like in the early days of the internet, you had to have like something that made the transition from a ground cable to a switch that then could go to the internet space. And Huawei was brilliant at that, and they did it amazingly, and they developed a lot of that switching technology, and you know sent it out throughout Western China and then through Africa, and they were very powerful at this. But if you think about that issue, that's all about the flow of data, right? And so this is what gets us really nervous when we think about the high tech industry. And the early tensions with Huawei were sort of the beginning of that space, but like we're deep in it today because we're thinking about the flow of technology in so many different sectors like AI and the flow of information across many different spaces. And so again, I mean, the U.S. enforces export controls to protect national security. Um, and advanced technologies like AI chips and other things have dual uses. Like they're smartphones and servers, but they're also military uses. And so we have to really think carefully about these issues. And so, I don't begrudge the United States thinking aggressively and carefully because there are national security interests about the flows of technology. But sometimes I wish there was a little more deeper thinking and a little more diplomatic engagement around these issues. And that's what I've always been arguing as long as I've been engaged with Huawei, which goes back 15 years now.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, it is interesting you mentioned the dual use of these technologies. Do you really think this approach, blocking access, really protects national security? Or does it just push companies like Huawei to innovate around the restrictions?
I mean, I have a very clear answer on this, so thank you for this question. And my answer is blocking access does not protect national security. So I'm on that side of the fence. I think we, have a very simplistic idea of this, of thinking like, okay, well, if we block access, then we'll be in control of all of our data and we won't be sending our data to other organizations like Huawei. But the global economy is so nationally and globally integrated at this point that you can't stop it. You can't stop the flow of information. So the best way to deal with it is to have close diplomatic ties with major companies around countries around the world, like China, and really kind of think carefully about how to manage the technology. And in the early days, before Huawei's first ban from the United States, that's what we were doing. We were really pushing hard for just close diplomatic engagement so that we were controlling the flows of information and we were thinking carefully about how information flowed. But things just went, they were getting more and more tense from, 2010 to 2016, and then they went really south with the first Trump election in 2016, and so things have just been really negative since then. But I
So,
believe
why
that you
haven't
have to
these
have engagement.
conversations really taken off? I know that their first significant ban occurred in 2012, when U.S. government restricted federal agencies from using Huawei in their equipment in their networks. So why, it's been 13 years, why haven't the conversation really taken move forward?
Well, I think I'm disappointed in the United States for poor diplomacy. Like what we saw in the years from, we saw Deng Xiaoping come to the United States and shake hands with Jimmy Carter in 1979, and then we saw, open economic engagement in the 1980s, and we saw more and more technology transfers for joint ventures happening during the 80s, and then under Zhu Rongji and Jiang Zemin in the 1990s, we saw more aggressive approaches to this. But that was a time that was really interesting to me because I credit President Bill Clinton for being very aggressive in the engagement policy. And so we thought carefully about like, yes, okay, our economies are coming together. We are having a lot of our corporations investing, and we're giving a lot of technology to China, and we're getting a lot of cheap labor, and we're getting access to the world's biggest marketplace at the time. But we're going to have a number of things that are going to really kind of curtail what is done, and we're going to be at the table in all of these conversations. So the engagement policy happened in 1994. There was very close relations between the U.S. government and Jiang Zemin's regime through the rest of the 1990s. And then we see China's entry into the WTO. I think then sort of markets opened up more generally, and we just saw lazy diplomacy under the Bush administration, and then I don't think President Obama did very well either. And then we saw just a disastrous approach to it under the first Trump administration. And so I just think we've seen the markets opening up together, and we've seen a lot of companies making a lot of money, and our two economies have grown very dramatically, but we've just lost diplomacy. And that's what I think, Christine, is the most important thing is that if you want to have a healthy global economy, you need to have both capitalists like, you know, Tim Cook and Elon Musk at the table, but you also have to have presidential individuals and people who are, secretaries of state and secretaries of commerce who really think deeply about these issues. You can't have people like Peter Navarro advising Donald Trump on how to do trade relations because these people just don't think deeply about these issues.
I remember in 2016 when I took your class, Apple in China, your whole focus is educating all the leadership within Apple to understand China, whether they're design leaders, ops leader, or product leader. So I think perhaps we need a educational course for the State Department and the Commerce Department.
Well, I love that idea, Christine. And yeah, I don't want this to be self-serving, but I believe in education and diplomacy. I believe that we all should be sitting down at the table and thinking deeply about not how can we make the most money, but okay, how can we make a lot of money and have things that are good for everybody, but also be thinking carefully about the handling of data and carefully about the handling of human rights. And so, yeah, I believe in all of those issues very deeply. And so, yeah, so maybe we should have a course that's on, how to educate people to think about diplomatic commercial ties. I will say one thing that happened not too long ago. I uh, I was in some conversations of having the exact kinds of educational things that you're talking about with the State Department. And you may remember this, but the On Global Leadership website, uh, our little think tank posted an article that said communist China is better at capitalism than the United States, period. And I got a call from the State Department telling me, you will never be able to come here and give lectures and teach us if you don't take that down. And I thought it was a
What
really,
year was this? How
uh,
long ago was this?
this was about 3 years ago.
That's
Yeah,
wow. Being blackmailed by
I
State
would.
Department is kind of cool.
Well, you might think they're cool, but
Well,
I
not
was really
they're not cool. It's a
right.
milestone of your think tank.
Right. Well, but I also was just like I was like, I was on the phone with them and I was like, you get the irony here, right?
Yeah.
You're nervous about a communist economy, a communist government that censors information, and you're telling me to take an opinion piece down because I said that communist China is better at capitalism than we are. Like, and they were like, yeah, just get it down. And I was like, okay. So I'm not sure how much they'd be wanting to have me in to teach them about diplomacy, but I think you're right. We need to learn. We need to put together economics and diplomacy, and it's never more important than it is now.
Well, I want to switch focus on how exactly Huawei's chips are embedded with a US technology. So I did some research. Because the chip global chip making processes heavily rely on American innovation. They include the design, software, EDA, key internal IP, cores, and then specialized manufacturing equipment. So even if a foreign company makes chips for Huawei, they actually use US technology in that process. So there's a rule called Foreign Direct Product Rule, FDPR, that lets US restrict those sales, effectively control chips made outside its borders. So even if Huawei seems to be working independently for the last few years, there's still a deep connection to US technology. So now let's shift gears and talk about Huawei's position. Despite their efforts to separate themselves from the US government, US still treats them as a proxy for Beijing. So, Doug, you consulted for them. You work closely with their leadership. How do you see their efforts to distance themselves from the government? Is that similar to what you've seen with TikTok?
Well, wow, those big topics and big questions, and let me take first the question about Huawei, and then talk about the comparison or the parallels between the two companies. I mean, going back to my early days and working with Huawei, and again, I was working very closely with them from 2010 to 2013 when I was um, in Washington, D.C. And I got the argument, right? So Ren Zhengfei was, the founder of Huawei was, he was an ex-PLA guy, and he had served in the military. He was a party member. And he was developing switching technology, which was capturing all kinds of data and passing it on into from hard cables to the internet technology. Um, and Huawei was pretty clear about the idea, like we're not aligned with the government, we're not giving them data, but like it was a hard argument just because like okay, so I was sort of making arguments in front of Congress saying like, well, I've heard from the leadership of Huawei that they're not doing that, and they're like, okay, like what evidence do you have? And so because they were closely embedded. So even though they were a privately held company, they were still a Chinese company. They were the largest Chinese private company. I mean, eventually they went public, but they were the largest Chinese private company, and they just had a lot of ties to the Chinese government. And so I got it when I was making these arguments in front of the U.S. Congress. Like they were like, Doug, come on, man, show us some evidence. And so in their case, I didn't support the ban, but I understood it better. To go to your parallel question, in the TikTok case, I mean, you and I have discussed this before, so I won't repeat too much. But you know, in with ByteDance was very, very, and I think they learned from the Huawei case. I don't haven't talked to any of the leaders of ByteDance about this, but it seemed to me that the way they established the company and the way they set up not just ByteDance and its relationship with the Cayman Islands and its relationship with Singapore, but also the way they established TikTok and had a completely separate entity between TikTok and Douyin, Douyin the Chinese version, TikTok the international version. It just seemed like they were thinking very, very carefully about, okay, if we want to establish for the world how we are differentiating ourselves from the Chinese government and how are we setting up an organization like TikTok that is completely independent of government influence, they were doing that. And so just to answer the question of your comparison with Huawei, I was a big advocate of us, being partners and really thinking carefully about it. But when I was pushed by people in Congress about it, it was harder for me to make the case because they were deeply embedded with the Chinese government. In the case of TikTok, I was very annoyed with what happened with the U.S. government and Congress because it seemed to me they weren't looking at the evidence of how the company ByteDance had established its subsidiary TikTok to really be independent of Chinese government influence. And so I just think, again, it's not just about diplomacy, but it's about people in Congress and people in government thinking carefully about these issues and making smart decisions that are really based on evidence.
Well, so in both cases, their fates are less about what they're doing, but more about what they might do under Beijing's influence. That's got to be a tough spot to be in. So, Doug, before we wrap up, what do you think the global ramification of all these export controls are?
I think it's bad for the international economy and bad for international business. And again, I get it. Like if we're sort of in what we might think of as a contested or adversarial role, um, we need to think carefully about this. Now, one of the things that often annoys me about people who talk about U.S.-China relations when they make comparisons between U.S.-China relations and U.S.-Soviet relations in the Cold War era, these are very, very different times. Like when we were in the Cold War era, post World War II, before the fall of the Berlin Wall, the Soviet Union and the United States were nuclear enemies and we had nuclear weapons pointed at each other. But after Deng Xiaoping came to the United States in 1979 and opened the doors of China, we've been partners of China in the economic growth of this country for the last 46 years, and we have benefited tremendously from that. We have, not only benefited tremendously economically. I mean, Patrick McGee's book talks very clearly about how China or how Apple is the most profitable and valuable company in the world precisely because of its relationship to China, right? And Apple's not the only one. Tesla, Walmart, we've talked about this many times. The single largest exporter from China to the United States is an American company. It's called Walmart. And so, we've all benefited tremendously. And I think we would be much smarter to think about the economic growth and the diplomatic growth. And yes, things twist and turn. And in 2013, maybe things took a more negative turn for China, and that's a concern for everybody. But we're still there, and we're still doing diplomacy, and we're still thinking about economic growth together. And I just wish we would think more carefully about how to continue to grow together. And I wish Peter Navarro wasn't advising President Trump because I actually think that there are a lot of smart people out there who think much more growth oriented and ecumenically about how to develop economic growth together. And I think we just need that right now.
Fascinating insights, Doug. This is an evolving story, and I'm sure we'll revisit it soon. And for now, thank you for joining us on China in the News.
Well, thank you for co-hosting this with me, Christine. Like this is just I always enjoy our conversations, and I think this is such an important time in the global political economy, and I think China in the News has something to say about it. So thank you for helping.
That's it for today's episode. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe to stay updated on the latest in US China relations and global technology trends. See you next time.
Thank you, Christine, and thank you everybody who's following us.
Bye bye.